You know, I got a letter a couple of months ago from a viewer, and they asked me this question. They said, Pastor Mark, why is it that when you tell stories about praying for the sick, you only tell stories about where you prayed for somebody and they got healed? How come you don't tell stories about when you prayed for somebody and they died? Well, that's sort of an easy question, isn't it? That's a softball. Like, who wants to listen to those stories? I got tons of them. I mean, what kind of sermon would that make? So I prayed for this guy, and he died. And then I prayed for a guy the next week, and he died. And then I prayed for a guy the next week. He didn't die for a week, but then he died. I mean, what kind of course I'm not going to tell those stories. Who wants to hear those stories? I could tell you those stories. I could depress you all day long. I've got way more failures than I have successes. That's not really the point, but I thought it's kind of true. That maybe what we need to do is remember that we don't always get the outcome we had hoped for, but what we always get is peace in the midst of the storm.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
And so my message today is called Sunshine on a Cloudy Day. We all know what it is to have a cloudy day in life, and we're going to discover what it is when the sun breaks forth into the midst of our cloudy day. I don't have to convince you about this, but I did bring a picture, and this is the same scene, half of it in a sunny day, half of it in a stormy day, and it's amazing how much different things look when the sun shines. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. I've got a passage I'm going to share with you that you think when I give you the reference, Numbers chapter 6, that you don't know, but as soon as I read it, you're going to recognize it. It's well known to pretty much everyone. And so this is it, Numbers 6, verse 22. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. Say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the children of Israel, and I will bless them." You all know that. How many of you know that? And that is called the Aaronic blessing, because it came from to Aaron, to the people of Israel. Aaron and his sons were the high priests. Not to be confused with the Aaronic blessing. Here's the Aaronic blessing. As you slide down the banister of life, may the splinters never point the wrong way. Also a very good blessing, but not quite the same. And this Aaronic blessing is very famous within Jewish circles. If you spend any time in a synagogue in Israel or around Jewish people, you will hear it, and you will hear it often, because it is such a positive thing, and it illustrates God's love, care, and concern for his people. And there's a few unique things about it. One of them is that it keeps on mentioning the Lord's name. It says, the Lord will bless you. The Lord will cause his face shine upon you. The Lord will lift up his countenance upon you. And so we know it's all about him. But here's what's most fascinating about it, if you think about it. When you look at the pagan gods throughout history, you actually had to try to get their attention. They were always usually pretty distant and disaffected, and you were always trying to get their attention. Whereas you look at this, God's trying to get your attention, right? He's reaching out to you. It's a very proactive blessing. It says this is what he's going to do. He's reaching out to you. Or like the song we sang today, God's goodness is running after you. And so we look at this verse, and he says, Aaron, this is how I want you and your sons, the high priests. This is how I want you to speak to Israel. I want you to tell them that God is chasing after them and that he wants to bless them. And then he uses this expression. It says that his face may shine upon you. And some translations, and maybe yours is like this, it says that he may smile upon you. And you see, that's what we rarely think about by that, but that's what God does. God's smiling upon you. And there's something really powerful about the smile. They've done a lot of research on this. They've been researching smiling for 300 years. Do you know that? And they always come to the same conclusion. It does a lot of positive things, smiling, but one of the things it does, it's an invitation. that when you smile at another person, you have given them an invitation. You know this is true when you walk into some sort of service organization, a parts store or a bank or whatever, and you have a bunch of people there to serve you. Which one do you go to? The one that looks up to you and smiles. You know that's a fact because a smile is an invitation. And do you know that intuitively, involuntarily, babies start to smile at 2 years old, or 2 months old rather, they've said, and it's an invitation for you to engage them. And we do the same thing, don't we? We see those little kids and we smile, and it's an invitation, and that's the connection. And I think this is the way we need to view God. I think we need to imagine that God is smiling. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at sunshine on a cloudy day. I'm going to give you 3 points because there's 3 points in this verse, and this is what they are. Number 1, he gives us protection in this present darkness. Number 2, peace in a perfect storm. Number 3, pity in a pathetic mess up. And we're going to look at them one by one. So the first thing he gives us protection in this present darkness. He says this, the Lord bless you and keep you. The word keep means to protect, means to sustain. And you know, he told Aaron this, Aaron and his sons, that to tell the people God's going to sustain them and he's going to protect them. And Aaron knew all about this because Aaron was Moses' brother and he was there with them when they came out of Egypt. And there was 10 deadly plagues that came upon the Egyptians, and not one single Jew died during that time. God protected them. He said, I want you to know this is who I am. I'm the God who protects my children. So I want to read you a verse that probably all of you know. I'm not going to read the whole thing, and I'm going to just pull an excerpt out of it. But if you ever want to know about God's protection, if you ever want to know what his will is to protect you, go read Psalm 91. Psalm 91 is an amazing verse, and I just want to pick a couple out of it. And verse 5 says this, you shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that walks in the darkness, nor the destruction that lays waste at noonday. 1,000 may fall by your side and 10,000 by your right hand, but it shall not come near you. Did you catch that? It says even the pestilence that walks in the darkness, even though 1,000 may fall by one side and 10,000 by the other, it's not going to come near you. And I just wonder, and I know the global, COVID-19 pandemic was a horrible thing. It was a dreadful thing. I know that. A lot of people died. It's true. We probably all know somebody that died during that. But why was it we let fear grip our hearts so much? Why did we let the narrative of fear that bombarded us day by day, and I kept on telling people for that 2 or 3 years that we cannot walk in both fear and faith at the same time. And fear is the enemy. It's antithetical to faith. And what we needed to remember is that God was going to protect us. And here you are today. Guess what? You got through it. God protected you through this. And as we look in Scripture, we see this again and again. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they got thrown right down into the fiery furnace, and they survived. And Daniel, he got thrown into the lion's den, and he survived. Jonah was swallowed by a fish, and he survived. He was in the fish for 3 days. 3 days. Any of you fish? Any fishermen in the room? Any few fishermen in the room? I've caught a lot of fish. I'm a fisherman. I've caught a lot of fish. And I've often found stuff in the fish. They eat stuff. You know that? I found mice. I found frogs. I found leeches. And all those creatures had the one thing in common. And guess what they were? What was the one thing all in common? They were dead. They were all dead. Every one of them. How was it that Jonah survived in the belly of the great fish? I don't think we know. It doesn't really matter. Maybe he was risen from the dead. The point is, he says, I will bless you and I will keep you. And when we get to heaven, here's what I think is going to happen. When we get to heaven, God's going to show us the timeline of our life. And he's going to show us all the places where he spared our life all the way along. And most of them you're not going to know about. Because he protected you. You didn't fall into that thing. That incident or calamity did not happen to you because he protected you. How many of you know of at least one time when you should have died and you didn't, and you're still here? Look at all the hands. Half the hands in the room going up. You knew you should have been dead, but you weren't. So you know of one. There's going to be a whole host of other ones dotted along the way. And every once in a while, God shows us that he was at work. And oftentimes in unusual circumstances, because God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. So I remember one story. Kathy and I were on a ski trip. We were just the two of us. We were driving out west. We were going through the wonderful province of Saskatchewan. And the one thing that happens in Saskatchewan in the winter is storms. And we went into this storm, and it was snowing, and it was blowing, and the visibility got bad, and the road became completely covered in ice. It was just absolutely treacherous. But I had a plan, and the plan was to get to Medicine Hat because I had made a reservation in a hotel. And I will always risk my life to get a reservation on a non-refundable room. So we're driving in absolute worst conditions. And we get to Moose Jaw, which is not Medicine Hat, still a goofy name, but not the same place. And we get to Moose Jaw, and this semi was going up this hill, probably the biggest mountain in Saskatchewan. It was probably 12 feet high. And this semi on the ice, his trailer kind of jackknifed like this. He plugged the whole lane, and he was stuck. He couldn't go forward, and he couldn't go backward. We were stuck. The police turned us around. The only place we could go was to Moose Jaw. And so we ended up getting a hotel. Thankfully, we got a hotel in Moose Jaw, and I was pretty happy about that. But I was mad because my hotel room in Medicine Hat was being wasted, and I'd paid for it. Did I mention that to you? Did I mention I'm kind of a cheapskate? Because it's kind of true. And so I'm sitting in the hotel room, and I'm mad. But the next day, we discover that a half an hour down the road, there had been a fatal car crash. Several people had died, and nobody had gone past that point. And so had we kept going, had we been able to keep going, we might have actually been in the car crash, who knows? But at the very, very least, we would have spent the night on the highway, and instead we were in a warm, dry, comfortable hotel with a free breakfast. They had that waffle machine that makes those nice waffles. And I looked back at that and I thought, I'm such a dope. I'm such a dope. God put that semi in our way to block us, and to me it seemed like an inconvenience, and it was God reaching out and protecting us. And you never know how God will do this. So I want to tell you the story about Corrie ten Boom. How many of you know who Corrie ten Boom was? A bunch of you know. This is the book she wrote, The Hiding Place, and a bunch of others. But anyway, it's a tremendous story about how during the Second World War, while they were in the Netherlands where they lived, they were hiding Jews from the Gestapo. And eventually they got caught for this. So that's why it's called The Hiding Place. They were hiding in the walls of their home. And they got caught, and her and her sister, Betsy, Corrie and Betsy, were imprisoned in a concentration camp in Ravensbrück. And they're both tremendous people of faith, and every night Betsy would pray, and she would thank God for what they did have, not what they didn't. They're in a concentration camp, and she'd say, I thank you, God, that we have a bed tonight. And I thank you, God, that we have a blanket tonight. And I thank you, God, for the fleas that are in the blankets. And Corrie kept on getting mad and saying, why are you thanking God for the fleas? And she said, well, because 1 Thessalonians tells us that we should thank God for all things and in all things, and so there must be a reason there's fleas, so I'm going to thank him for the fleas. And do you know that theirs was the only female barracks that the male guards did not come and violate them in the night? And do you know why? Because of the fleas. You never know what God is doing and how he is at work, because God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. So the first thing is this, is that God will protect us in this dark age that we live in. And the second thing is that he will give us peace in a perfect storm. Now he says that he will lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. And this is going to be one of those good news, bad news points. I just want you to know that. I'm going to kind of give a bit of a counterbalance, because sometimes things don't always work out the way you would hope. And the good news, bad news, you know the jokes, right? The good news, bad news jokes. Like the guy, you know, he goes to the doctor, he's been waiting for some test results, and the doctor says, I have good news and bad news, what do you want first? He says, well, give me the good news first. He says, well, the good news is that the disease is fatal and you have 24 hours to live. He says, that's the good news? That's the good news? What could possibly be the bad news? He says, well, the bad news is I meant to call you yesterday. And it's not a true story. Don't look at me like that. Oh, you're going, oh, that poor guy. He has only minutes to live. No, it's not a true story. But this is a true story that there's perfect storms in life. And here's the thing about perfect storms. There's nothing perfect about them. A perfect storm is a bad storm. A perfect storm is when everything conspires against you. A perfect storm is when everything that can go wrong goes wrong. That's what a perfect storm is. And what God says he will do is he will give us peace in the midst of that. So I think the most famous one of those is the story, it's in Luke chapter 8. You got the disciples and Jesus, they've been in the hills of Galilee, they've been having a good time. I mean, they've been feeding the multitudes, and they've been raising the dead, and cleansing the lepers, and healing the sick. And then all of a sudden, Jesus goes and he steps into a boat, and he turns to the boys, and he says, let us cross over to the other side. How many remember this story? Let us cross over to the other side. Now, we don't really realize what he meant when he said that, because Galilee is in the northwest of the Sea of Galilee, and on the other side is a place called Decapolis, in the southeast side. And it's Decapolis because it was 10 cities. They were all pagan cities. They were places of idol worship, and there were places of pagans, and there were places of evilness. And not only did they not go there, the Jews never went there, they didn't even talk about it. It was forbidden to even talk about the Decapolis. And Jesus says, let's go, get in this boat, and go to the other side. So this is already a bad omen, because they are heading the wrong direction. But they get into that boat, and off they go into the Sea of Galilee. If you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee, it's an interesting place. It's 13 miles long, 7 miles wide. It's not that big. But you have hills on all four sides, and it looks like a giant cereal bowl, right? Just waiting for the alphabets. That's what it looks like. And what happens is when these systems move in over the hillsides, they create these tempestuous storms that just whip up in a matter of minutes, and the waves can go 6 to 8 feet tall, and you've got boats that are 20, 25 feet long. And that's all they are. And what happened that particular day was there was this huge storm, and the water began to come into the boat, and the boat began to sink. And who remembers what Jesus was doing? Anybody remember? Sleeping. He was sleeping on a pillow. Now, why was he sleeping on a pillow? He was tired. That's why. He had a busy day. I just explained that to you. He was really, really tired. And so he's sleeping. And then the disciples wake him up, and they say, Master, wake up. Do you not care that we are perishing? Question for you. If he said, do you not care that we are perishing, if they thought they were perishing, do you think they were perishing? I think so. I think they had been on that sea every day of their life, and if this was a storm to end all storms, if this was a perfect storm, and if they were going down, if they thought they were going, they were probably going down. So, I mean, in a natural sense, they were right. And they said, Lord, do you not care that we are perishing? So that's a pretty negative thing. Jesus wakes up. I don't know how you imagine him waking up all cranky. What are you guys doing? I was sleeping. No, I think he woke up and he smiled, because that's my message. I think he woke up and he smiled and he says, why are you guys so fearful? Like, dudes, come on. Where's your faith? That's what I think he said. And then he looked up and he said, peace, be still. And the winds and the waves went calm. And it says they marveled and said, what manner of man is this that even the winds and the waves obey? And the thing about that story is what he gave them was peace in the midst of a perfect storm. It was a perfect storm. Everything conspired against them. But in the midst, and what it was literal peace in a literal storm. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about figurative peace in a figurative storm. We all go through the storms of life. And in this particular instance, it worked out just great. Everything went well. And he ended the storm. But we need to understand that peace in the midst of the storm doesn't mean the storm will necessarily end. What it means is that God will give you peace in the midst of that storm, and it may not end the way you had hoped and the way you think. And Paul tells us about this when he says, be anxious for nothing, but with everything in prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart and your mind. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding. What does that mean? Peace that does not make sense in the midst of a storm. And the promise is not that we're going to get the outcome we had hoped for, necessarily. The promise is that he'll always give you peace no matter what the storm you're going through is. You know, I got a letter a couple of months ago from a viewer, and they asked me this question. They said, Pastor Mark, Why is it that when you tell stories about praying for the sick, you only tell stories about where you prayed for somebody and they got healed? How come you don't tell stories about when you prayed for somebody and they died? Well, that's sort of an easy question, isn't it? That's a softball. Like, who wants to listen to those stories? I got tons of them. I mean, what kind of sermon would that make? So I prayed for this guy, and he died. And then I prayed for a guy the next week, and he died. And then I prayed for a guy the next week. He didn't die for a week, but then he died. I mean, what kind of course I'm not going to tell those stories. Who wants to hear those stories? I could tell you those stories. I could depress you all day long. I've got way more failures than I have successes. That's not really the point, but I thought it's kind of true. That maybe what we need to do is remember that we don't always get the outcome we had hoped for, but what we always get is peace in the midst of the storm. How many of you are following me so far? So I want to tell you a family story, probably one of the greatest storms we've gone through. So my brother and I were very close, my older brother. We lived on the same street. He lived 4 doors down from me. I saw him almost every single day. And when he was 51 years old, those of you that have been around long enough will remember this story. When he was 51 years old, he was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma cancer. So we were praying, and we prayed for months for him, and he went into chemo, and he lost all his hair, and he lost a bunch of weight. But after the end of 6 months, they declared the cancer in remission. And most people don't recover from stage 4 cancer, but my brother recovered from stage 4 cancer. So we were rejoicing because in this storm, we had seen the outcome we had prayed for, and it was fantastic. But then a couple of months later, he's feeling better, and he was a big skier. He used to be the ski school director at Sunshine Mountain in BC, in Alberta. And he took his little 6-year-old daughter out skiing, and they were actually on the Bunny Hill, and he got distracted for a minute, taking care of his daughter, and he fell, and he slid over onto the side of the hill, and he hit a tree, and he broke his neck. And my brother was lying on the side of the hill with a 6-year-old daughter, paralyzed from the neck down. And he had a C4 injury, if you know your vertebrae stuff, and a C4 injury. I remember that horrific night. And they told us his bones were brittle from the chemotherapy, and even though the impact wasn't that great, his vertebrae in his neck just basically shattered. And they bolted 6 vertebrae together, and then they told him this. They said, "You'll be in the hospital for a year, and you will never walk again." It was a great tragedy in our family, and my brother refused to accept that. He was a man of faith and incredible stubbornness. And so he told him he was going to walk out of there. And miraculously, 2.5 months later, he walked out of the hospital. Now, not well. He could not walk well. He walked like Frankenstein. And a lot of the reason he was able to stand upright was his muscles were firing and seizing on their own, and he was able to walk stiff, and he was able to walk out of there. And for the next year, he was in this terrible recovery and was showing, he was what they call C4 incomplete, meaning his spinal column wasn't completely severed. And so he had feeling and movement and different things come back, but he was still considered a quadriplegic. And so then a year went by of him in recovery, and the cancer came back with a vengeance, and this time the chemo didn't work. This whole time we'd been praying for him, and it was a perfect storm. It was one storm after another. It was one calamity after another. It was one challenge after another. And then what happened is during the chemo, he went into septic shock, and he went into a coma, and we thought that was the end of it. And after about 3 or 4 days, he woke up from the coma, and he sat bolt upright, and he says, and we were all there, and he says, "I want to talk to you." He says, "I'm not going to make this. I'm not going to make it. I don't even want to make it." He says, "I got nothing left in my body. It's full of cancer. I'm paralyzed." But he says, "I got something that gives me great hope because I have peace. I'm at total peace." And he lectured us, being such a bunch of wimps and worrying about him dying. He lectured us for not having faith. And his faith had grown and grown and grown during this time. And he says, "I'm going to be able to go and be with Jesus now. And that's an option not all people have, but I have. And I'll get to see my brother, one of our brothers that drowned in the Red River. I'll get to see my father." He says, "But more importantly, I get to go and see Jesus. So stop feeling sorry for yourselves and live your life the way you're supposed to." And 2 days later, he was gone. And you know, I thought we should all die so well, right? And I know that some of you look at that and you say, "Well, Pastor Mark, that's not a very encouraging story." Yes, it is. He found peace in the midst of his storm. And you know what? You don't always get the outcome you want or expect. And see, people think that faith is always getting the answer to your prayer the way you wanted it. That's not what faith is. You know what faith is? Faith is hanging in there and believing and trusting God even when you don't see the results. That's what faith is. Faith is persevering and persisting in the midst of the storm, not getting the outcome. And if you don't believe me, go read Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 talks about by faith these men overcame kingdoms, and they moved mountains, and they stopped the sun, and they closed the mouth of lions, and they survived the fiery furnace, and it goes on and on. And then it says, and still others were afflicted and desolate and were stoned and were sawn asunder, which means cut in half, and were slain with the sword. And he says, and all these people received a good testimony of faith, having not received the promise. We never read the end of that story. It says, you know what? Not everybody makes it. But everybody can still persist in their faith, because what God promises you is peace in the midst of a perfect storm. It's like the skydiver who's doing it for the very first time. And they said, look, once you get out of the plane, there's only 3 things to remember. Number 1, pull your ripcord. If that chute doesn't open, number 2, pull the second ripcord. And then when you get to the bottom, the truck will pick you up and bring you back to the base. So the guy jumps out of the plane. He goes, okay, number 1, pulls the ripcord. Nothing happens. Number 2, pull the backup chute, pulls the ripcord. Nothing happens. There he is, heading to the earth at terminal velocity. And he says, oh, this is just great. And with my luck, the truck won't show up. That's gallows humor, in case you're not clear about that. So the first thing is this, is that God will protect us in this present evil age. The second thing is that he will give us peace in the midst of a perfect storm. And the last and the final thing is this, he will give us pity in a pathetic mess up. And he says this, he will cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And that's talking about God's grace. And God's grace is an amazing thing, because a lot of these things we end up, these mess-ups they're pathetic, and we caused them ourselves. We brought them on ourselves because we make a lot of mistakes in life, right? And you see that God gave grace to a lot of people who made a lot of big mistakes. I mean, Moses, for example, led Israel, but before he did that, he was disobedient, and he killed an Egyptian. Murder even then was bad, And you had David, he committed adultery and still went on to be king. I don't know if you know this, but even then, adultery was bad. And you had Samson, he was sleeping with prostitutes. Well, I probably don't need to explain that one to you. And, you had all these people making these blunders, and yet God was gracious to them. And grace is God's unmerited favor. And I like to put it this way, you've got justice, you've got mercy, and you've got grace. And grace is the greatest of them. See, justice is getting what you deserve. And mercy is not getting what you deserve, and grace is getting what you don't deserve. So to give you an illustration here, you get pulled over on Pembina Highway for speeding, and the cop gives you justice, and that means he gives you a ticket. Or he shows you mercy, and he lets you off with a warning. Or he shows you grace, which means he lets you off with a warning, and he gives you one of his Tim Hortons donuts. See, that's what grace is. I remember when I was in grade 9, I had to get through French or I was going to be in big trouble, and all I needed was a D to pass. And I got an F on my French paper, and I said to my teacher, I said, Monsieur de Montier, I don't deserve an F. He says, no, you're right, but it's the lowest mark I'm allowed to give. You know what? We don't want what we deserve, people. We want what we don't deserve. And that's what grace is. In the midst of your biggest failures, he says that he will cause his face to shine upon you, and he will be gracious. This is the way I want you to speak to the children of Israel. Tell them that I will bless them and keep them. Tell them that I will cause my face to shine upon them and be gracious. Tell them I will lift up my countenance to them and give them peace so that they might have sunshine on a cloudy day. Let's stand together, shall we?
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.